Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And I wanted to thank everyone who had the time and opportunity to take the last study and survey that I sent out and advertised about a month or two ago. I actually recently got all of the participants that I needed to stop gathering data for that and start analyzing data. My final sample size ended up being 68, which is the exact number that I needed for my power analysis. If you're not into statistics and psychology, power analysis is essentially when we say, okay, I know that this is the type of analysis or study that I'm going to be doing. How many participants do I need for this analysis to be meaningful? Like, if I have less than this number, it's probably not going to be as valid of a study. And for me, my power analysis suggested 68 participants, and that is what I got. I could have stopped and waited longer, but I got what I needed, and it was quite difficult gathering participants. Anyway, that's besides the point. I got what I needed, so thank you, everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit today about the results of that study and some of the data that I collected and how I think it's just kind of interesting. One of the things that I was really trying to analyze with this study was the nuances of the relationship between personality traits and coping styles or coping strategies. Now, this is not a novel or new idea. Personality and coping have been linked for 20 plus years now in the research and the literature. I'm actually doing a systematic review right now with a mentor where we're going to be looking at that research and kind of synthesizing it. But this is to say that this isn't novel or new information just between these two things. But what I wanted to do was explore a little bit more of the nuanced relationship. How does personality and coping work together with different coping strategies to influence, reduce, or increase perceived stress? So my outcome variable, the thing that I was interested in seeing if it was going to change, was perceived stress. Is this influenced by the relationship between personality traits and coping strategies? First, let me lay out what my variables were and what I mean by perceived stress. So, perceived stress is one of the most common things that we measure in psychopathology research. And that is essentially when we ask the participant what their levels of stress are in their own mind. So, we're not measuring an objective measure of stress. We aren't measuring exactly what stress is. We're instead asking, what do you feel or think about your own stress levels? What have you noticed about your stress levels? Now, these things tend to be highly correlated with other measures of like actual stress, but those things are much harder to employ in survey research, which as a graduate student is kind of what I'm limited to. So, the perceived stress scale is a scale that is very commonly used in psychology research to get a general idea of what people's stress levels are in their own mind. In terms of personality, I used the Big Five, big surprise. And a lot of you may be wondering, this channel started a lot with like MBTI and personality types. And as someone who's in clinical psychology research in particular, we don't really use the MBTI much because it's just less precise in terms of measuring things related to traits that involve psychopathology, like stress or depression, these sorts of things. And we want that kind of fine point, that really exact measurement if we can get it, which is something that the Big Five provides for us. So we typically use that as opposed to types in research. This isn't to say that you couldn't correlate these findings to type, and the correlations would be very, in my opinion, easy to just mentally come across. And I'll talk a little bit about that later so you can see what I mean. But for this study, and actually for most of the studies that I'm going to be doing in the future with personality traits, it's going to be with Big Five. Particularly, I use the Big Five inventory, which is a common measure of the Big Five personality traits. Now, for coping strategies, I use a measure called the COPE, which, that's the name. It's really not that complicated. It measures a variety of different coping strategies here. I'll kind of bring them up on the screen here where you can see. So we have things like positive reinterpretation, mental disengagement, venting, social support, active coping, denial, religious humor, restraint, emotional support. There's a wide variety of different coping strategies, and this measure allows us to see how much or how often people use or employ these specific coping strategies. And now you can kind of see that those are the three variables that I was measuring. So personality traits, different coping strategies, as well as perceived stress. And the goal was to see how personality traits and coping strategies influenced and worked with each other to impact perceived stress. And particularly, I set out with two primary hypotheses in mind, and I tested both of them, and then one of them came out as significant while the other one was not. The type of coping that I was interested in the most is known as problem focused coping. And problem focused coping is the combination of a few of the different coping strategies that attempt to address stressors in life directly. So, among these strategies, you have instrumental social support, active coping, restraint, suppression of competing activities, and planning. So, instrumental social support is essentially when you're going to a mentor, guide, teacher, friend, and asking them for help, but not in an emotional support kind of way. You're asking them for something that will guide you towards a solution. Active coping is when you experience a stressor and you're doing everything in your power to like literally address that problem right now. You're not avoiding it, you're not shying away from it, you're trying to deal with the stressor now. It's like, instead of not going to the dentist because you're afraid of the dentist, you literally just face your fears and go right into the dentist and you do the thing. Uh, Restraint would be stopping yourself from doing things that might make the problem worse. Suppression of competing activities is going to be when you stop activities outside of things that are going to be focused on the problem itself. So let's say you stop playing video games because you know that video games are not helpful and they're not going to address the problem of bad grades that you have. So you suppress the competing activities. Whereas planning is when you, as the name suggests, make some sort of plan that will help you to address the problem. And this could be laying out like a 1 week plan, a 2 week plan, or anything that's essentially going to give you some sort of path to take that will lead you to an outcome that will address the stressor. Prior literature in personality and coping research has told us that personality traits have a relatively, notable relationship with perceived stress. So, conscientiousness, for example, tends to have a strong negative correlation with perceived stress, meaning that the higher you are in conscientiousness, the lower you're likely to be in perceived stress. On the other hand, neuroticism, which is the personality trait associated with negative emotionality, is highly associated positively with perceived stress. If you're high in neuroticism, you're more likely to view your life as being stressful. The other personality traits do have a relationship, but it's not as significant or meaningful. For example, extroversion and agreeableness are both slightly negatively correlated with perceived stress, meaning if you're higher in these, you're likely to have a slightly lower perceived stress than the average person, but this relationship is not as strong as conscientiousness. So now that we know that these relationships exist between personality traits and perceived stress, my goal was then to see how problem focused coping would work as a moderator between these things. So when you add in problem focused coping, how does this influence the relationship between personality traits and perceived stress? My first hypothesis was that the relationship between openness to experience and perceived stress would become more negative, meaning a reduction in perceived stress with higher openness, when we introduced problem focused coping in the middle. And actually, the results suggest that this was not the case. And surprisingly, out of all of the personality traits, openness had the weakest relationship with perceived stress. The correlation was 0.013, which is really, really weak. It's practically non existent. And also, when I ran the moderation analysis, there was no significant pathway between openness and perceived stress, even when introducing problem focused coping. My original idea was that people who are open to experience would be more likely to engage with new ideas, especially ideas that might be focused on addressing their problems. They might be open to hearing more solutions. But this doesn't appear to be the case, and it doesn't seem that, at least within this analysis and in this data set, that there's any meaningful relationship between openness to experience or perceived stress. Now, my second hypothesis was one that I thought was a little bit more safer, as in I really thought that it was going to come out the way that I thought it would. And that would be that the relationship between conscientiousness and perceived stress would become more negative when we introduced problem focused coping in the middle as a moderator. And this actually was the case. There is a significant relationship between conscientiousness and perceived stress in my moderation model. And there was also a significant interaction term, meaning that these two traits interact significantly to influence perceived stress. What's really interesting, though, is that problem focused coping on its own wasn't related significantly to perceived stress. So just problem focused coping without the conscientiousness wasn't showing any significant reduction in perceived stress. But when you introduced conscientiousness into the mix as the main variable, it was showing a reduction in stress. So what does this essentially mean? I know this is probably a lot of jargon to people who aren't really into like psychology research. So as conscientiousness rises, so you'd have like the different levels of conscientiousness. You've got low conscientiousness, high conscientiousness. As conscientiousness gets higher and you introduce problem focused coping, people who are going to be addressing their problems directly, it more greatly reduces stress in individuals who are high in conscientiousness across the levels of problem focused coping. So, across the levels of conscientiousness and across the levels of problem focused coping, we were seeing a reduction in perceived stress when these two things interacted with each other. And this essentially means, I'm boiling down the complex here, but this essentially means that conscientious people are either one, using problem focused coping more to directly address their stressors, which is reducing the stress, or conscientious people are more effectively able to employ problem focused coping to reduce their stress. And I can't tell you which one of these things is more likely or more true. The analysis doesn't give us that information, but it does tell us that when these two things are interacting with each other, conscientiousness and problem focused coping, we see a greater reduction in stress. So this leads then to the question, well, why is it important to know that? So my primary research interest is how can we tailor therapy or intervention methods based on someone's personality to have better results for them. So let's say in the future I'm a therapist or psychologist, which I'm not now. Let's make that very clear. Let's say in the future I am. And I give someone a basic personality test, like a 5-factor test or something, and now I have their personality profile in front of me. I then see that they're very high in conscientiousness. They're like 80th percentile in conscientiousness, but they're not the most agreeable person. So they're probably not very social, but they're hardworking and dedicated. And then they tell me that they're stressed. This analysis that I've done suggests that if I want to reduce their stress, I could probably do so, probably, this isn't definitive, probably do so by helping them engage in problem focused coping. So, as a therapist or someone working with a highly conscientious individual, if I'm helping them address their problems directly, their conscientious personality is probably going to either one, appreciate that, or it's going to be able to better employ the things that we're working together on to help reduce their perceived stress, as opposed to something like emotional support or avoiding the problem or maybe even just talking through things. Now, my analysis didn't look at all of those things to see if those were also effective or ineffective. I could potentially do that with exploratory analysis, but it wasn't my original hypothesis, so it would be a little more shaky if I wanted to do that. So my then future hypothesis would be, well, what can we test across the coping strategies to see if there's meaningful differences? But for now, we know that in this preliminary analysis, remember this is a relatively small sample size, we know that working with conscientious individuals and then aiding them, helping them, introducing them to problem focused coping will likely reduce their perceived stress. So that's something that is really interesting and meaningful to me because now we have better ways of thinking about how we work with individuals in interventions, which is what I want to do primarily with my research in the future. And I know earlier I mentioned that you could probably correlate this to something like MBTI with personality types, and you easily could. Like conscientiousness is highly correlated with being a judging type, specifically an extroverted judging type in the Myers Briggs model. So if you were working with like an EJ or maybe like an INTJ or something along those lines, you could probably say, well, we're probably more likely to reduce their perceived stress if we help them do things that are focused on addressing the problem directly as opposed to these other methods. So that's really what is interesting to me research wise. And that's what I plan to be doing as I hopefully will be pursuing a PhD in the next few years and as I work as a researcher in the future. So a lot of the things that you see from me in the future are probably going to be along these lines, where my goal is ultimately to see how personality traits can help us inform personalized interventions and treatment plans for people. The last major thing that I wanted to talk about in this video was just going to be correlations. Now, remember, correlation is not causation. So these are just relationships that were observed within the data set that I have. But I think that there were still some really interesting things that popped up. So the most notable and interesting thing to me that was I thought kind of cool was that when I summed all of the coping strategies together into one score. So I took all, I think there's 14 of them, and turned them into one sum score, and then correlated that with the personality traits. Openness to experience had a significant relationship with the coping total score, and it was higher than all of the other personality traits. So openness had a 0.450 relationship correlation with cope total, which was relatively high and higher than the other personality traits. Conscientiousness had a 0.371, extroversion had a 0.313, and those three were actually were actually significant, while neuroticism and agreeableness did not have any significant relationship. Now, conscientiousness had the highest correlation with problem focused coping, specifically at 0.555, which is a pretty big correlation when we're talking about personality stuff, while openness had 0.449. But what I thought was interesting about this is that essentially means that people who are high in openness to experience are more likely to employ a large variety of coping styles or strategies compared to people who are low and openness to experience. And this means that they're more likely to employ both positive and relatively negative coping strategies across the board. So while they might be more likely to engage in active coping, planning, these sorts of things, they're also more likely to use humor or behavioral disengagement or even substance abuse compared to some of the other personality traits. And I just thought that was kind of interesting. I'm going to leave the correlations between the 5 personality traits and the different coping strategies up here on the screen, and you can kind of sift through those and see if there's any other relationships that you think are interesting. If you're someone who's not really familiar with statistics too much, what you want to be looking for is the little stars. One star essentially means that we're 95% certain that there's a relationship there given this data, whereas 2 star means we're 99% certain, whereas 3 stars suggest that we're 99.9% certain that given this data set that there is a relationship between these variables. And you can actually see with like openness to experience and coping total with a 0.450, we are 99% certain that there's likely a significant relationship between openness to experience and total coping score. So thank you everyone who took the time to watch this video, who took the time to do my survey, who helped me out with my research. This is the kind of stuff that really fascinates and interests me. Let me know if you have any questions down below. Let me know if there's any things that you think are interesting about this, or if there's anything you'd like to know. I'm happy to talk about anything I can given the data set. I only have access to this data set for a few more months because with the way research works, we have to designate a period of time where we delete and get rid of data for confidentiality, privacy, that sort of thing. And I think I had 6 months with this data set, so I have like 3 or 4 more months. But thanks for watching. I will see you all soon. Bye bye. All right, Nero, say hi. Say hello. That's a big boy. Look at that big boy. Look. Hello. Hello.